episode, guys. Today we have a special guest, one of my favorite analysts here at National Bank, Angelo Katsoras, I believe it is, right? Geopolitical analyst here at National Bank. I'm also sitting with Sean. Welcome, Sean.
Hi, Jalal. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing excellent, especially after the morning presentation with you.
I find you especially frothy today after hearing Angelo's presentation.
I always love his presentations. I won't deny it. I always love his presentations, your analysis, the conclusions that are drawn. You're not too... I would say, Angelo, you're not too negative, but you're also not too positive about things. But here we are. We're going to have a quick chat. Sean and I have a lot of questions for you, and then we'll get started. Sean, where do you want to start?
You know, so when I think of you, Angelo, sometimes I think of that Billy Joel classic song, We Didn't Start the Fire.
Yes, I remember that song.
You know that song? Because I think you, because there's so much going on. That could feel like a 5-minute song.
Yeah. How you keep up with all
We
of it?
didn't start the fire part 2. Ukraine, Russia.
Sure.
Where we're at.
Okay, well, when I look at Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, in addition to the actual battle, right, what I look at when I'm trying to get direction to this war and its duration is just the amount of damage is brought upon Ukraine. Okay, so the World Bank said a few months ago that it would take $500 billion to repair the country. Doesn't probably take into account that 30% of the land is covered in chemical debris or landmines. So even if the war starts tomorrow, you're not growing much food from this land for a very long time.
Right.
Which historically it's been known for its agriculture.
Yeah, well, it's the best agriculture in the world. You don't have to use fertilizer. The black earth, best in the world. And then 40% electricity, the transformers has been brought offline. It'll take 6 months, but I think that's optimistic. And then you have the fact that the West has been incapable of producing sufficient weapons. And when I use the U.S. as an example, there's 2 reasons. Number one, consolidation. In the U.S., there was 50 main defense suppliers in the 90s. Now there's 5. And just-in-time supply chains mean they have very limited military industrial capacity. And some of these supply chains, like Boeing, for example, their suppliers, they have 800 suppliers. Their suppliers have 30,000 suppliers. And then their suppliers have suppliers. And so as we saw on their civil side, when one thing goes wrong, it shuts down. And then you have very little other options, right? And so you have that thing. Now, the aid that was given to Ukraine will hopefully stabilize the battlefield, put them in a better position when negotiations do occur. But whatever you do have negotiations and a ceasefire eventually, you'll have the war of the peace, where Russia will do everything it can to keep that region unstable, while the West, if they have the abilitiness and the money, will try to keep it make it into a rich, freedom-loving country opposed to the opposite, the side that's going to be occupied, kind of like West Germany, East Germany. But this burden will fall mostly on Europe, and this will be very costly.
Now, help me understand Russia.
Sure.
Okay. Because I always thought they were the country that was under sanction, not, for instance, Canada. Yep. And what I'm seeing now is that the Russian economy is starting to grow again.
Yep.
It doesn't seem like there's any abatement of the ability for Russia to send troops and armament and et cetera into Ukraine and continue the fight. Putin is revered by the Russian people, as I understand it. How does this war end without the Ukraine eventually being occupied? Because it just doesn't seem like any other war Russia's ever fought. They're going to stop. They're going to lay down their arms and negotiate a peace. I could be wrong.
I think he's gonna fight until he thinks he has no more reason that it's not worth fighting anymore in terms of gaining territory. And the $60 billion is hopefully an opportunity to stabilize the lines of the fight, right?
And sorry, the $60 billion you're referring to?
The $60 billion,
aid,
right? That was given by the United States, would help stabilize the lines. Now, Russia has pressures where it's a war economy, so all the money's going into the military industry. But then you're starting to see floods, you're starting to see shortages of goods, you're starting to see missing airplane parts, but these are longer-term weaknesses.
So the sanctions are biting,
but more of a longer-term.
Right.
Well, because you're putting all your money into industry, but you're underinvesting into electricity, or investing in the ports, into the hydroelectricity facilities, and there's been things breaking down right over the last few months. But this is a longer-term issue, right? But I think he sensed weakness on the West. He sensed he was gaining, and he pushed.
Yeah.
Right. And the U.S. hope, I think, is to try to stabilize the situation, that if there is negotiations in the future, it puts Ukraine in a bit of a stronger position, right? But the U.S. faces that test where it's more important for Russia. Is Ukraine more important for Russia than it is for the United States? Is Taiwan more important for China than it is the United States in terms of geography and history, right? So it's always that. That's why the burden will fall even if there's a ceasefire, supporting Ukraine will fall mostly on Europe, just because of geographical factors.
Well, and it looks like, the United States is caught in what I would describe as an existential sandwich, in that you can't, like this is if Ukraine were to fall economically, it's not going to hurt the United States all that much, or Canada, from my understanding.
Yep.
Okay. However, you are sending a message to the world that it's okay to just invade a sovereign land and take it over, which is not something I think it's not a message I think the United States politically wants to send.
And even more importantly, send the message that you weren't able to properly defend, help your ally. And then you also create pressure on Eastern Europe, whether it's psychological or not, right? And then you send a message regarding Taiwan to China, right? So there's a lot of factors in this. And if there's human rights abuses after, if it were to collapse, right. This would be a nightmare as well. So I think you have all those factors, right? And where I think the U.S. is probably going to pressure Ukraine to really focus on defense, because I'm not sure they have the manpower. Like, demographics is really bad there, where in 91 there was 51 million people. In 2022 there was 38 million people. 8 million people have left.
It's a massive drop.
Several more million people under Russian occupation. And the longer the war goes on, the less of a chance they come back.
People will come back.
And if there's one thing Russia does not have a shortage of, it's people. And they've never been afraid to mobilize people in war.
Their demographics are bad, but just until the moment you look at Ukraine's.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So bad, let's say bad, good to great, that book. Well, this is bad to worse, right? You take it like a little bit of a different way, right? And so that, that kind of adds to when you look at Europe, because Europe, from a geographic perspective, is very unlucky. They're surrounded by instability, right? It's Russia, Belarus, it's Ukraine, it's North Africa, and Turkey, Middle East is not too far away. So they literally are surrounded by unstable countries. And we're surrounded by two oceans in the United States. So just from a geographical perspective, we're much more luckier.
But that's Canada. The U.S. south of the border
has their issues.
They have their issues. Yeah, like South America. I don't know. You mentioned stability a few times. So South America has its own stability issues.
No, they do.
I believe, right?
I think even though there's the immigration, which is maybe a immigration situation which could be solved, the new administration or not, we will see. But they do have their issues with the cartel and things like this. But there's not I think Europe's dealing with several hot spots, right? Several hot spots.
Which is brought that up, and I've never looked at it quite that way. I mean, I've always thought of that as it relates to Israel.
Yep.
Israel's been surrounded by enemies from their very existence.
Yep.
But I never thought of that way with Europe, in that they have
unstable countries or unstable regions or countries in war, right?
Yeah, not necessarily enemies, but not friendlies.
No, and just the chaos from immigration to this, right? And this is a region which has not invested in defense like Canada, but they don't have the oceans like we do, or America's the neighbor.
Yeah.
Right? So it's a little bit,
we'll get into that later, right, Jalal?
Yes, we will. You mentioned it a few times.
Okay, so Europe is surrounded by a whole lot of instability, particularly south. You have Israel, you have the Gaza Strip, and
North Africa, just general instability.
We can have like several podcasts about all the areas in the world but it doesn't sound to me like the Russia-Ukraine war is going to be solved in months. This could be a years-long thing. What about the Israel, Gaza-Hamas war? What's your feeling on that?
Well, what I've been saying from the get-go from this is, like, as longer the war goes on, what we're witnessing and what I warned about was that it's this increasing tit for tat, where every response is met by a gradually more tough response, right? It just keeps on the tit for tat that occurs, whether
subtle escalation.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, whether it was the U.S. soldiers being targeted and soldiers actually being killed, and the U.S. responded. But if they were soldiers to be killed again, they'd have to respond maybe by directly attacking Iran. And then you have the direct attacks, where even if Israel's response was considered moderate, you have the fact that now once you cross the line of direct attacks, you can't uncross that line, and so the price of miscalculation becomes an option of whether you directly attack. And I think the hope that you could have is that a temporary ceasefire really closes time, really lowers temperatures a bit.
Down, yeah.
But it's just this tit for tat, right? And now we're in,
because if you look at the sheer size of the two different countries, you look at, I think Israel's a population of 7 million, I want to say, in or around there.
Something like that.
I think Iran is 90 million.
Yep.
And I think the Israeli military is one of the great militaries in the world. But Iran's a big country.
It would be a missile. It wouldn't be like a war like you would consider in terms of that.
Like a conventional war.
It would be missile exchanges.
Okay.
It would be proxies, right? It would be things like that, right? And the Israeli message was when they hit the base was, look how easily we avoided your anti-defense missile systems and we knocked them down, right? That was the message in that attack, right? So it would be that, because they're far enough apart. Well, right, but the proxies could put pressure, but it would be a missile kind of exchange. At least I think so, right? Who knows?
Well, we talked about the United States being in an existential sandwich. Israel is in an existential tough spot too, because the way I've heard it put, rightly or wrongly, is that if Hamas and the areas around Israel were to lay down their arms, my understanding is that Israel would lay down their arms as well. But if Israel were to lay down their arms first, they'd be obliterated.
That's questionable.
That's what I've heard. I don't know if that's the case, but
there's a mutual look. If either side will consider the other side to be the devil, right?
Yeah. I'm not trying to choose sides.
And that's what it is. So there's this mutual distrust where now they say, look, Israel's worried about Lebanon, saying could the same thing happen with Hezbollah crossing the border, with Hamas crossing the border, right? So there's but the two sides, and it makes it very difficult to trust each other in terms of negotiations, right? And so we'll see if there's a deal on the table supposedly, and they're kind of debating it, right? And we'll see if this occur. But this is where one of the few chances we'll have to lower temperatures,
right? Because
I don't see it otherwise. I just see this continual tit for tat.
Right? But at least unlike the Ukraine-Russian scene or that conflict, there is negotiation happening. That there is
the potential
for something good to happen from that end, versus there's no sign of a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine.
Well, eventually, not right now, right? Eventually, I guess in the worst case scenario, we'll have a cold, like a North Korea, South Korea border where there's, no one declared peace and it just kind of it freezes. That's the best case scenario in Europe, right? And Europe,
that's the best case scenario in
the short term, right? But then Europe has what you call a militarized border, right? You'll have a militarized, like NATO, during the Cold War, NATO was thousands of miles away from the Soviet Union border.
Right.
Now they share a border of thousands of miles, right?
Yeah.
So it's a big difference. So there's that, but it's two very tough situations, and if Russia feels they have more ground to gain, and remember, defense is much more difficult than defense, and we'll see if they also crash in their turn, right, when they make their spring offensive. But I mean, when you look at Europe, that's another cost for them, in addition to their higher operating costs and other challenges that they're facing.
Let's venture to more happier pastures, don't we? China-Taiwan.
China-Taiwan-US.
Because this, I think, has a chance to really impact investors, has the real chance to impact the economy that we would feel day to day.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit, Angelo, around what you're seeing, between China, Taiwan, the U.S. response, and is there knockdown effects from this that could really occur?
Well, what I did in one of my recent presentations, that I don't have a crystal ball, but I tried to do a scenario. Okay, so you wake up in the morning, and without getting into the conflict, you wake up in the morning and China decides to blockade Taiwan.
Right.
And what does the U.S. do without getting into the arms side? Right. You put sanctions on the banks, agriculture, the dollar. Right. You tell some of your companies to shutter their operations. China, which accounts for 30% of the world's manufacturing, says, okay, we're not going to give you components for your EVs, medicines. Other industrial components, right, for solar panels, you name it. And so without even getting into the conflict, just this counter sanction and sanction would be much more damaging than an actual war in Ukraine by many times. And you would hope that both sides see this, right?
Well, one thing you mentioned that I loved in your earlier presentation is China outdoes the U.S. in ship making. What was it like?
But over 200 times to one.
Like for every 200 ships, for every one ship that the U.S. produces, China produces 200.
Well, that's it. They have the capacity to...
Or they have the capacity.
Yeah, which is pretty well running at full, but they're expected, I think about 230 ships, and it's warships, container ships, naval ships, every type of ship, right?
That's productivity.
Yeah, well, this is with the U.S., World War II was known as it was the arsenal of democracy, right? But this is kind of shriveled a bit, right?
Yeah.
And so part of the U.S. subsidy push, right, is to try to re-industrialize these things. And I think they haven't talked about shipping per se, but now they're starting to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, now that we're on the topic of like China and Taiwan and U.S. and obviously TSMC, one of my favorite companies, but like the U.S. military or any military requires access to really advanced chips, right? And right now the U.S. obviously has the world's most advanced chips. And as you already mentioned in your previous presentation, China has the second-class chips, such as the ones that you said go in your washing machine or go into your EVs and stuff like that, right? And it's funny how you worded it that, for the average family, what do they care about? AMD's top-of-the-line chip or NVIDIA's top-of-the-line chip, or do they want a functioning washing machine in, right? So that's an arm that China can really push on against the U.S. economy, right? But what I'm seeing is, for example, you have companies like Huawei who are coming out with very advanced chips, not as advanced as AMD's or NVIDIA's, but Chinese technology is coming up with very advanced chips that can possibly put TSMC or the American chips not as significant worldwide. And then in that case, let's say, like from the way I see it, and tell me if I'm wrong, but China has the advantage of producing these chips at a lower cost rather than the U.S. just because of their economy, the way their economy is.
Well, for the moment, when China surprised us with Huawei with the advanced chip, they used a lot of lower end chip making machines.
They did,
right? And they combined, like you put them all together, so it's not something that's like economically, let's say, viable, but they did it to prove a point, right?
Yeah.
And so for the moment, they did it, but they didn't do it with the most advanced. And since only one company, ASML, makes it, and I think one in Japan or whatever.
Yeah.
But so they did it that way, right? Which is like the brute force way as opposed to the other way.
Yeah.
Now you can argue that China eventually will, because when I used to have a slide in my PowerPoint where how many TSMC engineers now work in mainland China. In fact, for a while, China was telling a lot of these engineers, if you move to China, we'll double or triple your salary.
Double or triple, wow.
Yeah, and then Taiwan made it illegal to move to China, mainland China, right? Because there was this kind of like emptying it from within, right? Strategy.
Sure.
So the moment when they did that, that was an important feat with Huawei, but it was done with using a whole bunch of lower end chips, right?
Yeah.
So that's a big difference, right? In terms of trying to compete with and it's one of the few sanctions that can work because there's only two companies that make the most high-end chips. So if one sanction will last longer, I'm not saying eventually won't, because they have this brain power that's moved from Taiwan there, right? But it is only one or two companies, so it might last longer than a lot of the other.
I agree.
In efficiency, right? And so and that's the thing. And in going back to Taiwan, one thing I wanted to mention where people are worried about the invasion, and if you're the U.S., if Taiwan was to fall, you'd have this this very bad choice to make. Do you bomb the facility so they don't fall in Chinese hands?
Right.
Do you create a shortage? Do you airlift the engineers to the U.S.? Or, as I mentioned in the presentation as well, do you say to yourself, if you're China, you know what? Everyone's building semiconductor facilities, high-end, low-end, and maybe in 15 years, Taiwan won't be important enough to defend anymore.
Right.
And this is the ultimate nightmare for Taiwan because they have a semiconductor wall, and this wall could erode, and then that's why there'll be a big push for Taiwan to make keep the most advanced chips within Taiwan, and I'm surprised that U.S. is pushing them for even the most advanced chips within U.S. as well.
Right.
And then, but going to the U.S., as we talked about earlier, it involves higher costs because you got to build things from scratch. And TSMC said, okay, if you have a chip, buy from Taiwan, this price. You buy one made in U.S. at this price, and of course, you're a company, you're going to want to buy the cheaper one. But U.S. will force you, for an American company, to buy
the American one.
But there is too. I mean. Not to disregard the chip issue as it relates to China, Taiwan, but there is a geographical proximity issue. If Taiwan were to fall by military aggression via China, you'd probably have some nervousness from Japan. They're relatively close. They don't get along at all. I mean, they get along, but they have a history of acrimony, to put it mildly. And so at the end of the day, there is a geographical, let's say, urgency, for lack of a better way to describe it, as to why the United States, apart from chips, would want to preserve Taiwan's sovereignty relative to China. Is that a right?
Well, you know what? By far the semiconductors are the most important because I think 6% of the world's semiconductors are made there, 90% of the most advanced. And it's not something you can move very quickly, right? Already with Taiwan had to bring in its own workers in from Taiwan because there's no schools. Everything is kind of like the things that existed before don't exist in terms of training. Japan, ironically, even though they have a less labor shortage, they're older, but population, they still have the memory of making them. So it was easier for TSMC to make it there, ironically.
Yeah.
Right.
And right before we were chatting, you said it takes 3 years to build a foundry. What's the saying? 3 years to build.
Well, there was a saying, and I don't have the exact phrase, where they were interviewing someone at TSMC, and they said, "Well, how hard is it to move?" Right? And he says, "Well, it could take 3 or 4 years to build a foundry, but it could take 15 to 20 to develop the necessary, brain power. Build the schools, train the people, give them the prerequisite experience. Right?
Build the wafers.
So what happened is when the West, we made a mistake. We stopped learning by doing. What I mean is that we designed it in the old days until the person would drive over to the factory and practice, and then we sent it overseas, and now we lost that part of doing, and we're trying to recreate it basically from scratch because the whole generation is gone without doing it.
Yeah, and I think you and I have spoken in the past, Angelo, about North America's, just because you mentioned, we created it, then we sent it overseas, about North America's productivity in general. Like just the fact, what are we producing? Are we producing, and are we producing it fast enough, right? I think that just bears importance on things like, for example, if TSMC, for instance, was to come to, or even when Intel's saying that they want to create new foundries in Europe or even in the States, I just feel like North Americans don't really want to work, or they're not as productive and as efficient as prior.
We've forgotten how it is to make stuff like, rare earth minerals. We don't have the mines that we're polluting. We don't have the refineries, which are, also like, have a big footprint.
Yep.
The solar panels are, even if IRA subsidies, are cheaper to make in China because lower end chips were low margin. Those things were lost as well, right? The ship making we talked about, medicines, right? And 75% of antibiotics, blood thinner, things like this. That has also got to come. We'll have to eventually come back, but you have to recreate the skills for it and accept what I call the footprint. Because as I mentioned the presentation, where we had a hard time meeting our environmental targets when we outsourced everything to countries with lower environmental standards, and so we feel good about ourselves. Well, if you're going to succeed, which is a big if, of bringing the mines, the refineries, and the industry back, and you might have to have pollution go up a bit regionally before it goes down,
right? Because
you're going to have to build all this stuff, right? And so there's that challenge. Then there's the dynamic where the U.S. and Canada's found themselves. You move as quickly as you can to go to your green energy targets. You go from being independent oil and gas to being dependent on your number one adversary for the green energy supply chain. Right. But if you slow down your supply chain to give your the time for them to reach critical mass, you'll miss your environmental target by even farther than you would have done earlier.
And probably your competitors would outpace you at.
So it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. Kind of approach, right? And so and also for the mining, we're not graduating any mining engineers. The amount of mining engineers, like there's less interest among the younger generation to enter this, despite the fact
that the younger generation doesn't want to work in the deep mines.
They definitely
the mining engineers, right? Like they're
on YouTube.
Very different.
They're on YouTube.
Yeah, very different than like the old days. But these are critical.
Yep.
These are critical like positions that we're going to need.
But it's as Sean said. I think especially in the industrials, and this is something that I want to speak with our industrials analyst when we have him on in a few weeks. But I think especially in the industrial sector in North America, it's just North Americans don't want to go into that. They don't want to enter that. You're already seeing it in the very big void of individuals in the trades right now, right? Like the North America is suffering. There's no plumbers, no electricians, carpenters, and that generation that used to occupy these positions is slowly either dying off or retiring, and there's just not enough individuals to pump out for these trades.
Well, back to the China-US, let's say, issues.
Yes,
we're going down a path where there's going to be economic standoff between the two. It seems to be. It has begun, or it has happened, and it's starting to maybe accelerate. Is that a correct interpretation, or is that perhaps a little bit extreme?
We're beginning. I think we're in it. Like if it's a 9-inning baseball match, probably the second or third inning of a very long game, right? And it begins, right, where the U.S. is trying to reshore things, but it's very difficult because once again you lost your capacity in solar completely. You want to bring back the refined rare earth minerals, but you have to rebuild it from scratch and deal with the resistance to building some of these things, which can be very impactful and on the environment. And then you also have the challenge too, where we're in the U.S. and North America, where it's all these environmental local content rules, right? And so if you're in a company, not only you have to rejig your supply chains for geopolitical tensions, you have to rejig them to meet local content requirement rules.
Right.
And it's ironic because when China joined WTO, we thought they were going to become more like us, but in many respects, we've become more like them. We now have local content rules, subsidies, industrial policy.
Yep.
We've taken a page from their book, right? And that's why when you look at subsidies, right, where sometimes you're going to have to ask yourself, when you look at what sectors is like solar, for example, which is it too important to fail? So in addition to analyzing the quality of a company's products or services, you're going to have to analyze whether they're too important to fail for companies, or whether they have the ability to lobby for subsidies. So if we take rare earth as an example, 20, maybe 15 years ago, the price of rare earth minerals collapsed, right?
Yeah. And
we followed the rules of Adam Smith, let them go bankrupt, China continue subsidizing. Well, today now we realize we're in a position where we need these minerals desperately.
And China, by the vast majority, produces most of the rare earth.
They produce 60% and they refine 90%. So even if you build it here, you got to have to send it there most of the time, right?
Yeah.
90%. So you have to say that in certain sectors now, they're too important to fail.
Yeah.
Right? Certain sectors, even if the price does collapse, are they too important to fail? right? And so there's a different, you have to, a bit of an environmental, geopolitical wrinkle. And I'd also say where we talked about shipping, where I wouldn't be surprised where 8 months from now, we see a newspaper article saying some company got subsidies and their stock market price bumped. So I would argue, in addition to trying to analyze which companies are profitable before the markets recognize them, you have to analyze which ones are going to get subsidies before the markets recognize them. So it's another wrinkle to investment analysis, right?
Yeah.
In terms of like where it's not always the best company that's going to win, right? And also what I feel too is that with all these subsidies is that we're dulling market signals. Just like how QE up until recently stopped the ability of the 10-year bond as being a leading indicator of risk. All these market signals means that before a sector was heavily subsidized, before they built a factory, they'd say, is there demand? Is there demand for this? Now they're saying, let's build it while the government's paying for half.
Right.
And so you're going to go from extremes where you have too little something to too much something and back, because the market signals in some of these heavily subsidized sectors are now being dulled.
And we're seeing some of that even recently with Honda and the Allison, the electric vehicles plant, and the government subsidies we're providing for them.
Yeah.
So how does this end then? Like for instance, you see that the U.S. is going to be effectively banning TikTok.
Yes.
China has reciprocated in kind, not in the same timeline, but my understanding is you can't get Facebook there, not the American version, Instagram, etc.
Google. Yeah.
Where does this end? Like, how does it, or in your view, does it end? Because you can't have the two largest economies slugging it out in perpetuity, because that to me it's not going to win for anybody. It's not a zero-sum game. Both economies eventually could degrade.
Well, in the technological field, what you're seeing already is that they're just going to have two different standards. There'll be two GPS systems,
right?
Two different payment systems,
right.
Two different 5G networks, two different social media networks, right?
Right.
And so you're going to have these two incompatible systems, right? In many respects, maybe some different payment systems eventually, right? As well, and this.
But the U.S. has been screwed around with weights and measures since the revolution. They're fantastic at it. So they haven't had a compatible system for years. Like, would it be a problem for them?
No, but in terms of IT, right? Just
gotcha.
In terms of GPS, in terms of like 5G, in terms of so you're seeing different standards forming,
right?
Right. And so I think that's going to be like you're just seeing the what they call a technological divorce, where eventually they'll have just different standards, right? And what that makes India important, because India is a country that has their problems with China, and they've banned a lot of their products. And so when our U.S. IT companies go into India, it's one of the few countries in the world where they're not going to have Chinese competition on the social media.
They're going to love it.
Yeah, so that's the difference. But you're seeing this, right? And it's just, from technology, where the U.S. once again is talking about, the U.S. is talking about the security threat of electric vehicles, because the software can be used to spy supposedly on Americans, while China did that to Tesla for a little while, saying they were banning you for certain buildings because the software can be used to spy on high-level Chinese officials.
It's another tit for tat.
Yeah, it's a tit for tat. So you're seeing this and it's very gradual, because they're so interconnected. It's going to be very painful to do, right? There's a lot of this, but you're seeing it's something very gradual that's occurring.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's something we have to take into account. And if you're like a company, like, let's say, and also if you're an IT sector, it's getting harder and harder to serve both markets, because you follow Chinese rules, you're against U.S. rules, and vice versa.
Right.
So if you're like, even in the car sector, you're German, Volkswagen, 40% of their sales are in China. Then the U.S. impounds some of their goods, because supposedly there were some goods, some components made with forced labor. And if you say you're going to pull this joint venture, do you anger China, and does your market share begin to fall even further? Then it's already falling, because it's in a downward trend.
Right.
So you have to look at carefully these companies that are heavily reliant on China. And Tesla's another example where we mentioned they want more funding they want chips, but they want a CHIPS Act too, because they need more of it. Right. Part of it's the higher operating costs for setting up, and part of it's because Tesla's already told the U.S. government in secret, probably, look, 27% of our sales goes to China. We're going to lose this eventually. We're going to need to be somehow compensated.
Right.
Right. So chips is like, it's going to require just not for the higher operating costs, but also compensations for geopolitical factors beyond your control.
Well, you mentioned earlier, I mean, and like the United States is held up over centuries as the grand experiment in capitalism.
Yep.
Right. China, on the other hand, for the last, let's say, half a century, is the grand experiment of a controlled economy, where they let in capitalism, but really measured it, controlled it, so that it's spirited in certain areas of the economy, but by no means has it led to let's say, the democratic discretion that the United States would have. But now you mentioned that the U.S. is quietly adopting some of
the government intervention, right? Some models, right? Well, see, there's always been this debate where, in the West, we felt that you couldn't become rich without becoming free. Okay.
Right.
And, they looked at, South Korea, Taiwan, when they became a democracy. Well, the China feels they don't have to become,
They call them
become rich without being
Asian
free,
tigers, right? The Asian tigers, they call them, I believe.
And they became, democracies. And for a long time in China, a lot of these businesses, as long as you didn't get involved in politics, you could do what you wanted. But now we've seen some of the crackdown on the social media firms, where perhaps China was nervous how much access they had to Chinese citizens' data more than them,
right,
and their influence, right? And so there's a greater control now, and a company in China might say, look, I like this market, but I have to make sure, Beijing is in agreement with me, so maybe I'll do Plan B, right? And even for for bad debt, and in China, if you have bad debt, you can it's not like
go to jail.
That's it. You can go to jail. You can't get a government job. You can't. You go on high speed rail. Trains and planes. And in the U.S., there's a story. You go to I went to Silicon Valley. I went bankrupt twice. Third time I made it big. In China, it stops there.
Yeah, one time.
Yeah, and so you've modified animal spirits, right? And so we'll see if.
But you also probably stopped. I mean, this is a discussion for a whole new different podcast. But by having these rules, you also probably stop a lot of fraud, which obviously occurs in North America, right? Like a lot of credit fraud. People borrow loans for whether it's for venture projects and whatnot, and then all of a sudden it goes bust and money's gone and you just claim.
Yeah, but just imagine how many people who open businesses here that we know of that wouldn't have dared if they knew that the price.
Yeah,
failing.
I agree.
If the price of failing was not to be able to to ride a airplane or to work in a government job or even pay on mobile apps, right?
A little incentive to make it work.
Yeah, and so
do you think this is related to what Vietnam recently? I think it was Vietnam. Correct me if I'm wrong. The individual that they sentenced to death, that big real estate woman that they sentenced to death for fraud of like 13 billion yen or whatever.
It was a big fraud, but well, you're seeing.
Like, do you think Southeast Asian countries are trying to clean up that?
Well, these are two communist, countries, right?
Yeah,
or communist, right? And so there's we're hard to know whether it's a power struggle, right? And there is corruption, but sometimes where you could have used a screwdriver, used a hammer, right? And did you hurt animal spirits along the way? Right. And this is where the debate, and we'll find out who's right? In like 10 or 15 years from now, we'll find out who's the winner in these theories.
So wrapping this all up, and I know you mentioned crystal ball, Angelo.
You screwed up your crystal ball.
Yes, I screwed up my crystal ball. I know he has a crystal ball though, because this one of the things he said like about a year ago turned out to be totally correct. But anyways, what does your crystal ball here, Angelo, say about the modern day investor? Like what's going on? I think Sean, you and I were speaking about that. Everything that you see going on geopolitically and at the global level, what does this mean for the American Canadian investor? All this stuff.
For me, there's a couple of things when you look at the geopolitical environment, right? Number one, as I mentioned earlier, when you're doing asset allocation, part of your asset allocation should be focused on not where the company's headquartered, where they produce most of their.
Right.
That should be a different way to look at it.
I love how you word that. Yeah.
And then there's the fact how subsidies can maybe change the winners and losers, right? Such a big part of the game.
So subsidies
now.
And not only.
And then who has the pricing power when you rejig supply chain? Who has the pricing power to offset higher operating costs? And finally, we have this trend of where this massive subsidy trend, but we also have this massive debt trend. And where do you think it's going to collide first? And I think despite the fact U.S. does have higher debt levels, it has lower operating costs, lower energy costs. It's the world reserve currency. They have its own unified treasury, which means when they say that's $400 billion in subsidies, that doesn't take into account these are all unlimited tax credits, which can go to $1 trillion.
Yep.
And if you look at Europe, higher operating costs, no unified treasury, they have a lot harder time. So the guns versus butter argument, we're going to see that clash more there. Like we saw it where France recently said I want to increase defense spending, but then when they cut pension a bit, there was protests on the street. You saw the farmers. We're going to cut your subsidies, and we're going to give you more environmental regulations.
Sure.
Yeah.
While we import food from other regions with less environmental standards, and then they had to back down. Right. And then I think that one thing to be careful of in Europe is where in the UK there's going to be an election towards the end of the year, I think, or early 2025, where Labour Party on their platform is planning to spend more money than the Conservatives did, and that's not going to happen, right? So I think they're going to have their own guns versus butter moment, because for a long time politicians were conditioned where they could spend and they could put their hand on the oven and they wouldn't get burned.
Right.
And now they're going to get burned, but they psychologically haven't adjusted to this. So it's the part that's unlucky enough to be in power in certain of these countries are going to be punished politically, right? It's not going to be left or right. It'll be just who's unlucky enough who's going to be forced to make the cuts.
You're kind of caught in a rock and a hard place.
Yes.
Because if you overspend because of high interest rates, people are going to understand the debt servicing cost is a percentage of the budget's raising, and that's long term going to suppress standard of living. you decide to declare a period of austerity, that's not going to rock either. So you're kind of stuck.
Yeah, and Europe, they have the higher operating costs, higher energy costs. They've gone through some partial deindustrialization where chemical sector production has collapsed, for example. In some cases, the debts are higher than they were during the debt crisis. And so they have these challenges. And in a world that's increasingly automated, I call electricity prices the new labor. You're analyzing how competitive a region can be. Yeah, that also should be an important factor in asset allocation, electricity prices.
So finally then, Angelo, where does Canada stand
Great question.
in the global scene?
Well, you know what? I'll take it as when I look at North America, okay, as we mentioned earlier, they're surrounded by instability, we're surrounded by oceans. Secondly, we do have lower energy costs. That's a big advantage. We're one of the few regions of the world that can industrialize and maintain food self-sufficiency. When China industrialized, they lost their food self-sufficiency. They had to import 35% of their foods from being fully independent 20 years ago. We also can, as a country, move quickly. When you're unlike Europe, where it's like herding cats. Right. So you have these advantages, and I know we have the political scene in the U.S. We have to watch very closely. But Europe has the rise of the far right and the far left. At the same time, they're going through a partial deindustrialization where they're losing some of their industry. Right. Not only, also to the U.S. with these subsidies, with this big sucking sound, right? And so we have these advantages, right? When you look at it, so it's a tough geopolitical environment, and we have those advantages. It doesn't mean that U.S. is not going to lose geopolitical influence in certain regions of the world. That's just inevitable, right? The U.S. is going to have to partner with sometimes U.S. will partner with the country in certain subjects and be against them in other areas, right? Right. Yeah. But there are those advantages, right? And so I think we have to take those into account when you compare some of the challenges facing Europe, unfortunately.
Gotcha.
We'd love to have you back just before the U.S. election at some point and share your thoughts in terms of how things are going along. But, Angelo, we really appreciate this. This is
let's do it.
I like to think there's a lot of green shoots in what you're saying. There is a lot of off-ramps, but there's a lot going on. And thank you for sharing your in-depth perspective in terms of what's happening out there.
Thank you very much, Angelo.
Thank you very much.